Everyone knows Fallout. It's a Magic the Gathering card game set, a TV show, a mobile game, a live service multiplayer game, and at one point, there were even a few single-player RPGs. The setting is a post-apocalyptic wonderland where cheerful pop music is playing all the time. That music, in fact, appeared all the way back in Fallout 1's iconic intro from 1997. What's oft overlooked is that this was the only time it played in Fallout 1 until the end credits. You're otherwise left with foreboding ambient music that defined the first game's atmosphere. What else does everyone know about Fallout? Well, it's a universe that's designed according to how 1950s pop culture envisioned the future. This lends itself to a retro-futurist design that is the core of the series' aesthetic. And that's why you'd never see late 20th century icons like the Desert Eagle or P90 in a Fallout game. Wouldn't that be unfitting? The general impression of classic Fallout follows this pattern of misconception, and I've seen this misshapen image of classic Fallout confidently asserted to be how Fallout has always been in countless online discussions, a point which is often made to justify many of the creative decisions in newer Fallout media. It goes beyond specific elements like music or lore tidbits. The prevailing impression of the original game seems to be a misconstruction informed by their successors rather than their own image. The legacy of Fallout as most know it today is a shell of its former self, being reduced to the surface-level elements without proper consideration of the deeper substance. You may be wondering about what my stake is in this franchise that I'd make such a long video. I played the original Fallout games only relatively recently. It wasn't until 2019 that I tried Fallout 1. And I didn't play 2 until a few years after that. For the most part, I thought they were great games, but I, as with many others, had never really even heard of the Fallout series until 3 was coming out. And I adored Fallout 3, it was one of my favorite games as a kid. But as I played the original games, it dawned on me that my precious childhood game had made many mistakes in bearing the legacy of its namesake. I'm going to talk about the long history of thematic degradation of Fallout and the most prominent ways in which this has occurred. But before I get into the modern stuff, I want to take a moment to talk about how people conflate the memory of Fallout 1 and 2. It's easy to see why. They look similar, they came out a year apart, they have the same graphics and gameplay, and were made by many of the same individuals. It's reasonable to assume that they are basically the same game, that 2 is just the same but more. I certainly thought so for a long time. Truth be told, however, Fallout 1 and 2 are quite different. Fallout 2 is a massive departure from Fallout 1. The biggest difference between the two classic Fallout games is that the games are worlds apart tonally, especially because 2 lays on the humor and silliness much more strongly and prevalently. There are silly moments in Fallout 1, but they are few and far between or otherwise somewhat understated. You might have some self-contained Easter eggs or examine texts and combat descriptions or the occasional one-liner, but these are small things nestled within a vast field of deathly seriousness. Those few cases aside, it's not all that comedic. Fallout 1 is actually pretty dreadful on the whole. Fallout 2 somewhat imposes its goofy side over things that should probably have remained serious, blending the concepts a bit too closely. Take for instance Broken Hills, a town with a quietly brewing race war that threatens to destroy it, and your investigation into this will turn up an atrocity. These events are interspersed with hilarious things like a wacky scientist, a scorpion that can beat you at chess, a singing plant, and all manner of completely random, unfitting things. And this sort of thing leaves Fallout 2 at odds with itself because the general look and feel of that dreadful world was retained from the first game. And there are quite a few serious themes in Fallout 2, especially in Broken Hills, but the humor is so outrageously silly and widespread that it does detract from the game's serious side at times. And don't take it from me, here's what one of the developers who added these things to Broken Hills had to say in a No Mutants Allowed interview. I did a bit of design work in Broken Hills which probably felt really out of place. I came up with Mickey the Midget Treasure Hunter, the Professor and the Scorpion, and running over the ghoul with your car. The area was pretty sparse near the end of development and something needed to go in there, so I did what I could with my programmer brain. The developer here pretty much admits that they ran out of time and had to improvise. Not really phrased in a way that makes it sound like he considers this his best work. While it's rarely quite as intense as what we get in Broken Hills, this kind of misalignment, this tonal mismatch, is a recurring issue throughout Fallout 2. It's okay for a game to be funny, but it gets to the point that Fallout 2 is almost a genre parody, and that's bad because whenever Fallout 2 goes off about how awful tutorials are, or makes fun of the genre in any way, Fallout 1 is the butt of every joke. Fallout 1 itself was not parodical at all. It did not ask for such irreverence in its name. At times I felt that Fallout 2 overstepped its bounds, as if to say the first game was just a big joke and you were a fool to appreciate it on its own terms. But this essay isn't to air my grievances with Fallout 2, and I'm certainly not here to bash a developer, but obviously even talented, well-meaning people make mistakes. The reason I bring this all up is because when people say Fallout has always been silly, most of the time this is justified by examples like Broken Hills, which in this case specifically is something that really did not pan out all that well by the developer's own admission. Such is the problem with an appeal to long-standing precedent. The same logic can justify original sin. If you look at the full scope of classic Fallout, it's really easy to see that while they did have a silly side to these games, it was not meant to define the experience. Yet people are quick to claim, based on these instances, that Fallout never bore a standard of seriousness at all. My favorite thing about Fallout is how comedic it is.
Your bones are scraped clean by the desolate wind. Your vault will now surely die, as you have.
It's funny, isn't it? Now there was humor and irony in Fallout 1, but it was subdued. It's not really in the form of wacky hijinks or dirty jokes. It's more of a cruel irony that subtly underlies the game. A prime example is at the beginning, when you're supposed to go on that quest to save your people by recovering the water chip, and as you take your first steps out of the vault, the first thing you see on your journey is a skeleton outfitted exactly as you are. That's kind of funny, but it's not wacky and it probably wouldn't have you grinning. It wouldn't go alongside a laugh track. It's just this bitter, cruel irony. A sort of humor that doesn't detract from the dark tone, but instead amplifies it. It's still a pretty unnerving display. I don't mean to be too hard on Fallout 2. I really liked it overall. That was just one measure in which it substantially deviated from the original game in a way that I didn't personally like. However, Fallout 2 looks like the best sequel a game could ask for now that the franchise has itself mutated into a confounding new form. I want to temper everything I'll say about the new media with one important disclaimer. I don't think less of you if you like the show or Fallout 4. What I will say going forward is not an indictment of fans of the newer Fallout media. I also want to acknowledge that transitioning from one medium to another brings certain necessary liberties with it. When going from a 2D isometric old-school RPG to a 3D sandbox game, or going from a game to a show, a refractive effect is inevitable. What's not so excusable is when themes and symbols are shown to betray their original meaning in arbitrary, avoidable ways. With Fallout, one of the most prominent displays of this comes with the tone of the new media. There is a stark difference between the original tone and atmosphere of classic Fallout and that which has come to be known as the eminent Fallout style. This is easily observed in the handling of the music. People have this perception that happy, upbeat pop music really characterized everything about the games from the start, and that's an easy impression to come away with if you simply go on YouTube and watch the intros of the old games, which are assuredly representative of the general vibe of Fallout, right? Well, not really. Those types of songs play twice in each of the old Fallout games. Once at the beginning, and once at the end. The entire rest of the game was desolate and bleak. It wasn't full of chipper pop music that people now assume the franchise has always been blaring at you from start to finish. Of course, I know you can indeed play with the radio all you want from Fallout 3 and onwards, and that some people do this, but given the background music of even games like Fallout 3 and 4, it is obviously not conducive to the intended atmospheric experience.
Not one would mind, neither bird nor tree, if mankind perished utterly.
Take it up if you must, but it's kind of like the Wild Wasteland trait, in that it becomes an opt-in vibe killer that's not strictly enforced. Most importantly, even that much is a great departure from Fallout 1 and 2, which did not even have such a thing as an in-game radio as an option. Indeed, one of the striking things about the old Fallout games to me was the background music. The tone of the music is almost universally gloomy, foreboding, and oppressive, being more fit for a graveyard than a laid-back 1950s radio station. From the moment you step out of the vault, you hear little ambience besides the echoing winds of a dead world, along with disquieting, eerie music. It's haunting. Here's what Timothy Kane had to say about the design intent behind the music in the original Fallout.
Ambient music, I'm a huge fan of it. I didn't want standard game music in Fallout. I kind of wanted something, I didn't want something you listened to, I wanted something you heard. Something you would play the game and miss when it wasn't there, but not necessarily be humming it while you were playing. And I wanted to underscore that the game was desolate and have a sad undertone to the thing. Again, marketing wasn't sure. They came to me a few times and said, are you sure you want this music? Because it's kind of depressing. And I said, have you played the game? Everybody's dead in the world, it should be depressing.
Any discussion of the music in Fallout games tends to evoke memories of the upbeat radio songs. But the ambient music doesn't get enough credit, in my opinion, because it's a very important factor in setting the tone in Fallout games. And it's one part of the series' identity that Bethesda has generally done a fine job of transposing the essence of the original games with. You're hearing Fallout 3 music right now, and it's not the same intense, dreadful intonation typical of classic Fallout's ambient music, but it's still haunting. It's somber and wistful, which fits because Bethesda games are a lot more concerned with lamenting the past than classic Fallout ever was. And sure, this isn't quite the same intention as the musical language of classic Fallout, but that doesn't mean it's bad. Here we still have a sense of desolation being conveyed, which is thematically appropriate for a post-apocalyptic setting. What's not so appropriate is the show's approach. Almost any time the wasteland setting is actually in focus, where you see the environment without much action or dialogue going on, you're gonna be hearing the happiest, most easygoing songs you can imagine, and it doesn't fit. There are a few instances of eerie music. I don't mean to exaggerate and frame it like that's completely gone, but in general, the accompaniment of the wasteland in the show is most prominently cheerful rather than dreadful. Let's compare wasteland accompaniments between Fallout 1 and the Fallout show.
Let me wander over yonder till I see the mountains rise.
I'm not cherry picking here. This is representative. I understand that the show's trying to build a juxtaposition here. The thing about juxtaposition is that it only works if the elements actually retain a defined form and maintain some degree of separation. You have to have an A and a B for it to work. The first Fallout games took some time to set up a singular juxtaposition. Fallout 1 with that famous pan out from the living room. Fallout 2 contrasting the naively optimistic Vault Dweller survival guide with the cruel reality of the wastes. In Fallout 1, as soon as the camera zooms out from the pre-war living room and the desolation becomes visible, the music cuts out. You saw the fun part, and then the rug was pulled out from under you. Fallout 1 did not associate that cheerful music with the wasteland itself. It drew a clear line of demarcation, achieving the exact opposite of the show. The original game presented these elements as diametric from one another, starkly contrasting the horror and oblivion of the wasteland from the obliviously cheerful civilization that was destroyed. The images of before and after are established and imparted upon the audience. The before is shown to be gone, and what comes after could not be mistaken for it. The show's approach is very different in that they accompany lingering shots of devastation directly with that kind of music, and that's why the music in the show serves not to contrast but to associate the concepts, blending the lightheartedness with the wasteland. Perhaps it wasn't their intent, but the obvious takeaway here is a complete inversion of what the original games were trying to do with those intros. Another point of tonal disparity between classic Fallout and newer media is the handling of violence. There was a much grittier quality to the violence in classic Fallout, which has this horrifying, grotesque sprite work. The death animations are generally pretty scary and unpleasant, especially when it happens to you or your companions, when people are torn to shreds or running around in agony while aflame, and all sorts of other horrible things. I'll let some footage speak for itself. I don't want to make this too much about the game mechanics, but Fallout 1 and 2 were definitely way less inclined towards power fantasy by virtue of the gameplay. Rather than having enemies match your level, late game areas would be effectively impossibly lethal. Wander west from Vault 13 at the start of Fallout 1 and you'll be in for a shocking taste of just how unprepared the vault really is for the horrors lurking beyond. It's only by suiting up in power armor and getting a hold of the big guns can you dare to face the Master's army head on. And even then, it's not something to take lightly. Contrast this to Fallout 3 where you can find Enclave patrols right outside of the vault, and even on the hardest difficulty, you can take them down with a rolling pin. Your clueless 19-year-old Vault Dweller player character will easily bash his way through a bunch of security guards and waltz right out of the vault ready to beat super mutants in a fist fight. Generally, it just feels like the player character's a little too strong in Bethesda games. Fallout 4 even had the nerve to throw you in power armor to pick up a minigun and take out a Deathclaw in the tutorial quest, which is so brazenly off base and very much leaning into a power fantasy that the original games were decidedly not. Contrast this to Fallout 2 where you're running around with a spear and finding your first actual manufactured firearm is a momentous occasion. I think a lot of this comes down to medium differences when it comes to old versus new Fallout games, but the Fallout show handled it worse where they took violence in a comedic and goofy direction. It's not always like that, but it is a lot of the time. And many will argue that violence was always such a funny part of the games, but while there were slightly comedic text descriptions for the combat, it was never like Three Stooges slapstick with added gore. When I talk about the importance of violence, it's not because I'm an enthusiast for bloodshed, it's because this is actually a substantial deviation in a story that waxes poetic about man's cruelty and warlike nature. Violence was definitely part of what made the mood of the original games what it was, and it was usually tense and brutal. The most important thing isn't the visual effects though, it's that fighting really wasn't a prime focus of classic Fallout. To be clear, you are going to fight in classic Fallout unless you're doing some kind of gimmick playthrough, but you can avoid a lot of fighting. Whether it's by putting points in skills like Sneak, Science, or Outdoorsman, which can help you avoid combat encounters altogether, or selecting certain dialogue options with the speech skill. Most of the time, fighting isn't really the easiest way to solve your problems. Whereas in pretty much any 3D Fallout game, it usually is. And just look at the sneak skill, which goes from a way to bypass combat to a supplement to combat. Most of the time you do something in the 3D Fallout games, you leave a huge pile of bodies in your wake. The kill counts that you get over the course of a routine playthrough of each of these games speak for themselves. It's not even necessarily that the games have a pacifistic theme. While killing people was always part of Fallout, it wasn't really the point. And when you look at the newer stuff, especially Fallout 4 with looter-shooter mechanics, yeah, killing people is what you're here for. Much of what I've said may seem like aesthetic preference, but all of these tonal issues I've spoken of, the lightheartedness between the violence and the juxtapositions, that's the image of the franchise, the creative premise that it has now. And these elements coalesce into something that brings thematic degradation at the expense of nothing less than the thesis of classic Fallout. There's a point in the wasteland being a devastating nightmare. It's supposed to be hostile, not welcoming. You're not supposed to see this and think, wow, that looks fun, I want to be there. And I think that's my biggest issue with this tonal disparity in the newer Fallout media. It feels very much like it's designed for the purposes of gratification of the audience, which is a problem when this is supposed to be a cautionary tale about the cost of man's hubris. And the reason I use such strong words as betrayal is because if you take this Fallout universe and repurpose it into something so fun and happy that people would want to be there, you've failed. You've designed an apocalypse that people would see as a good thing, as a desirable end, when it was never like that in the original games. So obviously there's been a pronounced tonal drift in Fallout, and this carries thematic consequences, but I want to cut deeper into how this actually presents narrative issues. I would say the worst transposition of the original game's intent is with the expression of cynicism, especially with regards to how that reflects on characterization. And I want to demonstrate this straightforwardly with a comparison in dialogue from two similar characters discussing a similar topic. There's the Vault Overseer in Fallout 1.
You think the rest of us could survive that? Besides, I'd be out of a job. I'm management. It's not like I know how to do anything useful.
See, he's very self-aware and understands the limitations of his ability. He's not completely out of touch with reality. But this is also a clever maneuver because he is framing his ineffectuality as an excuse for him to avoid taking responsibility. It's something you can easily imagine a real person in his position saying. He's not a cartoon character. Whereas in the show, you get the Vault Tech executive Bud Askins saying,
"But it would have been insane to keep a failed nation alive, so we kept Vault Tech alive instead. A well-trained staff of highly supervised junior executives. The future of humanity comes down to one word: management."
So we have two kind of similar characters. Both are representatives of the institution of Vault Tech. Both of them pointedly make reference to the word management. One is just a guy speaking frankly to you, like a normal person. And you know, kind of a dishonest type, that Vault Overseer. He does end up stabbing you in the back. He's not a good person. It's not like we're really meant to like this character all that much. But he's also an understandable, kind of realistic person. And the show, meanwhile, has this character representing Vault Tech talking about management be this larger-than-life comic book supervillain type who elevates boring corporate jargon to the point of fanaticism, where he wants to reinvent the world in the image of this hollow corporate culture that not many people really buy into at all. And you might say, okay, but yeah, there are people who are like that. Sure, that might be a valid argument, but the point I'm making is that pretty much everyone in the show is like this. There is an overabundance of really, really silly people like Bud Askins. Nobody talks like the Vault 13 Overseer. Nobody comes off like a regular human being. For instance, all of the Vault Tech employees that got frozen and brought into the future are easily manipulated by offering them band-aids that are framed as Vault Tech tokens of corporate merit. Wastelanders are no different. That's just how people are in this world. And the show does all of this as a way to poke fun at authority. But Fallout 1 was doing that with the Overseer. They just didn't need to, dehumanize him into this ridiculous caricature. The same problem pervades the show's promo Vault Boy cartoons, and it's a product of this kind of irony-poisoned writing style. The old Vault Boy cartoons in the games were sanitized and naive from the start, like something you might actually see in a training program from the Second World War. The irony in Fallout was that their cutesy demeanor stood in stark contrast to the harsh realities of the Fallout world. It's like Mickey Mouse advertising in a world that feels like Mad Max. He's out of his element. The new cartoons cannot contain themselves. They have this palpable, brooding cynicism that is too strong to be even ironically cheerful.
For those too lazy to inherit any wealth at all.
They all but openly insult the supposed in-universe audience that would have been watching this, as well as the corporate oversight that would have produced these films. When you saw cartoons, they believed in what they were doing. They weren't making a wink-wink, nudge-nudge about how evil it is to drop bombs. But when you look at the show's cartoons, which constantly disgrace Vault Tech with self-deprecating remarks,
Hypocrisy is unavoidable with our current societal configuration.
all this palpable sarcasm, crass and grotesque visuals,
The few inbred runts left above will die alone.
veiled insults. Well, the only logical conclusion is that the cartoonists are in on the meta joke, which doesn't make sense for what Vault Boy is supposed to represent. The creators did not consider the in-universe human element that would go into the development of these cartoons. Actual in-universe humans would have produced such a thing, and those characters must be as comically unbelievable as the cartoons themselves if they go as far as they do in the show's promo vids. Because I cannot imagine any reasonable person animating, voice acting, or writing this stuff, and I can't imagine any fat cat Vault Tech executives signing off on these, nor an audience taking any of this well at all. None of the people in this universe could be anything but cartoon characters if this is what they produce and consume. You might think it's strange to identify cynicism as a point of failure in bearing the legacy of classic Fallout, as if those games weren't deeply cynical themselves. They were, but it's not a case of X exists in Case 1 and 2, therefore nothing changed. The character of the cynicism before was so different. Cynicism can take many forms. It can mean correctly realizing the futility of a doomed fight, or it can mean a petulant child cursing his family because they won't let him eat dessert 3 times a day. There is a time and place and method and proper form for cynicism, but without any bounds. Cynicism can easily lead one to be consistently off base and embarrassingly foolish. Classic Fallout had a measured cynicism to it, a dignified cynicism. The show knows no restraint. The cynicism in classic Fallout is when you walk into a new Reno crack house and Marcus, your super mutant companion, remarks that this crime-ridden hellhole is a great display of why the Master should have won. And what I like about this is that Marcus is a good aligned character with a generally strong moral compass, speaking his mind and explaining why he wishes your entire species had been turned into horrifying monsters, why he wishes that you had failed to save humanity in the first game. He doesn't say this with this irony-laced attitude that pervades this show anytime it portrays an ethos it doesn't like. Marcus gives a horrifyingly bad take, and he does so cuttingly with complete confidence. There isn't a wink and a nudge. It's just something to take a little bit seriously, reflect on. It's the kind of thing that shows you why anyone would ever be on the other side of a war that seems so straightforwardly black and white. This brings me to a point of contrast. My least favorite line from the show, where Lucy sums up the NCR Legion War and the dichotomy between the two factions as the difference between murdering people and being, in her words,
It's vaguely problematic.
and that's frustrating because New Vegas purposefully seeks to challenge the player's preconceived moral sense. The show is really punching above its weight by presenting this reductive, simpleton's interpretation of Fallout New Vegas' core conflict. Full disclosure, I don't think the Legion is good. I would not want a group like them to rule my society. But that kind of dialogue really downplays the faults of the NCR, which in turn undersells the story of why there's even a war to begin with. There's a world of difference between vaguely problematic and what we actually saw in New Vegas, which presented an abundance of evidence of the NCR being catastrophically ineffectual. The problems with the NCR are not vague. The game painstakingly expresses how dire the NCR's failings are. New Vegas shows the NCR in a world where good isn't good enough. A post-apocalyptic power vacuum where inefficacy can leave you vulnerable to wholesale slaughter. New Vegas, much like classic Fallout, presented its villains in more dignified terms. That's not to say New Vegas says actually the horrible people are good, but it does not pull any punches. They don't let you get away with lazy thinking that leaves you to believe that such horror emerges for no reason. And that is exactly what the show does when Lucy dismisses the conflict in black and white terms. Yeah, okay, Lucy is the naive vault dweller. You can make that excuse for her dialogue. The problem is the framing. The show lets her get the last word, presenting her simplistic and reductive argument as unassailable. The writers attempted to bear a certain standard of cynicism in pertly dismissing the Legion in such a way, but in refusing to afford them any legitimacy whatsoever, it ends up coming off as an inability to understand that kind of brutality. And you don't have to justify it in order to appreciate why it exists, and being unable to meet with it on its own terms comes off as, ironically, naive. My point here isn't just to defend New Vegas, but mainly to show that the cynicism adopted by the show is a much more simplistic and petty flavor, the kind to mock and ridicule rather than outsmart. There are many legitimate principles upon which the Legion can be easily dismissed, but the show only challenges their motives through the most petty means, naively self-certain in its moral superiority. Classic Fallout could indeed have had a character very much like Hank, but this discourse would have been handled quite a bit more Socratically, and he would have been able to put up a much better argument. Lucy's refutation of her dad, Hank, also bothers me because Hank's motivation is to try to forcibly unite humanity.
Gregory were from opposing tribes. If they'd met each other a month ago, they'd have killed each other.
And this is thematically resonant with the very first Fallout game because that is similar to the Master's justification for turning people into super mutants. The Master saw that as finally a means to counter Ron Perlman's intro, war never changes. He would put an end to man's warlike nature and unite them forever. It seemed like Hank, too, saw that war never changes. He has the same motive as the Master, and his method is to try to implant everyone with mind control devices so that he can keep people from fighting. I wouldn't say it's groundbreaking, but I actually thought it was a nice way to relate the show to the original theme. But unlike Fallout 1's brilliant conclusion with the Master, the show ends the conversation terribly. The show really misses the forest for the trees with Lucy's dialogue. What really ruins it is that Hank, just like Bud Askins, acts like a ridiculous caricature instead of a real person, somebody who's trying to resolve a real issue. Hank doesn't make the obvious argument that someone in that position should. He just starts drawing false equivalencies, like saying the NCR isn't perfect because they have an unfair tax policy. The framing leads the audience to believe that this is a battle of good and evil, and that only a fool would try to stop this war. Forget for a moment about how good or bad the NCR is. The message of classic Fallout is that no matter how righteous a war may be, it's a product of human nature, and one that lends itself to unbounded destruction. The games didn't concern themselves with the question of whether China or America was justified. For all we know, China was much worse than America. Even if we are to assume so, the point is that it doesn't matter given where things ended up. Likewise, the NCR being only vaguely problematic compared to the Legion should not be the point of debate in a conversation about the battered vestiges of humanity brutalizing each other for decades. That's how war is. It follows this pattern of escalation where the devastation brought on by the cycle of violence supersedes any intended ends. And that should be what Hank says. Fallout's message of the violent nature of mankind has always transcended the specific motivations of whatever groups of people happen to be fighting. The fact that they're fighting to begin with is what will be of lasting consequence.
Bull and bear over the dam, at each other's throats. All lose in different ways. A dam of corpses. Towns of corpses. Scattered across the sand. A rain of blood will flood the desert and not purify it.
And thus there's the superb irony that someone finally decides to get down to the root cause of war, finally put a stop to this awful human tendency once and for all. And it's the most horrifying means you can imagine, perhaps a greater existential threat than the nukes were. If you try to confront the Master with an argument like Lucy's, however, he's quick to point out that normal humans ruled the world before and it led to this. And I think in the context of the Fallout universe, that's a very good argument. Again, you're not supposed to think that the Master is right, but the narrative of Fallout 1 and 2 afforded him some dignity. The show just spits in the face of Hank. You're supposed to laugh at him, he's ridiculous. Which makes him not a very interesting villain, and leaves this attempt to represent an important theme from the original game as a botched effort. Lucy's refutation here is like if I looked at Fallout and I said, one side is America, land of the free. It's got elections, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, you're allowed to criticize the government. I mean, sure, it's got unfair taxes, it's vaguely problematic, but China has none of those virtues. They're authoritarian. Plus, they invaded Alaska. How can you even compare them? Is that really a sensible interpretation of Fallout 1? No, Fallout has always been about the pointlessness of eternally bearing these age-old grievances. All of this is to show that my issue with people acting like caricatures is not just a preference in a certain tone or dialogue style. This style of writing comes at the cost of higher-level themes, when the characters that are supposed to represent these themes undercut themselves by being too goofy to take seriously. Another issue with modern Fallout is that people tend to be way too invested in the past. This is a bit of an issue with modern Fallout in general, including most of the Bethesda games. They do have a very strong fixation on the past. Now, it's not necessarily bad for the narrative to focus on the loss, the death, and the destruction of civilization. It's very intriguing to us, and there's definitely an artful way that the narrative could be committed to that. Such things were not in the old games much, but I think this kind of storytelling can enrich the narrative. But where this often fails is when a modern worldview is imparted upon characters born 200 years after the apocalypse who probably wouldn't care about the things we find significant. And if you apply a higher order of thought, this could in fact be used to emphasize the tragedy, the absolute pointlessness of it all, as everything we care about, all of our history, culture, is reduced to pointless trivia to everyone still alive. But instead, what you see is characters pontificating about that stuff, acting like they have a stake in our concerns. Fallout 3 has stuff like the Lincoln Memorial becoming a refuge for escaped slaves because of its symbolic value. And Fallout 4 has the Minutemen adopting American revolutionary fighting spirit. There's a lot of this kind of mentality, and I don't know, how heavily does the atrocity of pirates weigh on your soul? It probably doesn't mean much to you because the pirates are all gone and it didn't take any nukes for that to happen. In classic Fallout, people do not care about things like elections or painting yellow lines on roads or Abraham Lincoln or any of those other things that we think are so important because they comprise our society and culture. If the structure of society has collapsed, everything building into it is meaningless. Wastelanders in classic Fallout are just left to think about the present and future. The past is just some mysterious thing. They don't think about it much. Modern Fallout made the mistake of imparting our perspective, our expectations, onto the characters. Their interests seem senselessly rooted in the time before the bombs dropped. One of the best displays of this is when Lucy meets an old lady in a place called Philly. And the old lady attacks Lucy for her rich pedigree. This old lady rants about how greedy rich vault dwellers like Lucy's ancestors just left everyone else to burn. Why would she even care? What stake does she have in a bunch of 200-year-old skeletons? Did her grandparents die in the apocalypse? Then how was this whiny old lady even born if she wasn't equally privileged? I can easily imagine a wastelander resenting a vault dweller for growing up all pampered and safe. But that's not what's even happening here. If anything, this conversation should be that personal, but it's not. It dredges up the ancient history. Lucy's attitude is problematic too, because she comes at this saying it's time to rebuild America, and I think that's a ridiculous pretense for a vault dweller to have. Yes, even if we account for experiments. I know the show frames it as Reclamation Day and all of that, but still, Lucy is our frame of reference for a vault dweller. The original game had vault dwellers say, it's time to build a new world, not worry about the old one. And I feel like that's a perspective that, ironically enough, has been buried. Part of the premise of Fallout, in fact, one of the most appealing things about this genre's fantasy, is that these kinds of petty squabbles have been buried under 1,000,000 tons of ash. I think the 200-year-old class warfare grievances would be among the first to go. It wouldn't bother me so much if this wasn't meant to be an actual point of characterization, an actual source of drama. They might as well start arguing about sports teams at this point. I want to give Bethesda significant credit for one important decision they made. Bethesda acted with humility and restraint in choosing to set their games on the East Coast. This was Bethesda offering the olive branch in a deliberate effort to ensure that the setting of the original games could continue unabated, remaining intact to potentially continue on a different trajectory irrespective of what Bethesda was doing. And while Bethesda made a lot of ridiculous leaps in logic to justify common elements in such an incredibly remote place where they have no reason to be, still, Bethesda's deliberate choice to isolate their spin on Fallout allowed New Vegas to continue from Fallout 2 without the story having to be upended. New Vegas was outsourced to a team comprised of many of classic Fallout's creative leads, giving them an opportunity to create a successor to classic Fallout according to their vision. Bethesda took their side of Fallout to the East Coast, partly with the intent that a game like New Vegas could be made. They deserve credit for a sincere effort to give the original games some space and to respect their legacy. If you don't like East Coast lore, you can take it or leave it and just go on with New Vegas. The show did not allow for such grace. The show set itself in the exact area that Fallout 1 and 2 take place, and made a point to revisit some locations only to bulldoze the entire setting, reducing the culmination of those games to nothing. Shady Sands, a small farming village, is the first sign of civilization you see in the Fallout series. Fallout 2 shows it having grown to the point of being an emerging nation. Shady Sands has become the capital of the new California Republic, with clean streets, democratic government, uniformed police officers, paper money instead of bottle caps. A real functioning society. New Vegas went on to show this as a growing nation that is expanding ever eastwards, placing you on a frontier that they're contesting. The NCR, with Shady Sands at its core, was the truest sign that the Fallout universe was actually going somewhere, that it had an actual storyline. And the Fallout show took this and cruelly bulldozed it. They nuked Shady Sands into nothing, and this has apparently more or less dissolved the NCR. This occurred for very little narrative payoff. To Bethesda's credit, such an act of narrative bulldozing is exactly what they sought to avoid by placing their game on the East Coast. When I say narrative bulldozing, I mean a creative practice where a sequel comes along and destroys everything that a predecessor was building up to for no real gain. The problem isn't that there's destruction and death, it's the failure to capitalize upon it, to draw anything interesting from such destruction. The decision to nuke Shady Sands isn't something that could never have worked, but what do we get out of nuking Shady Sands? Mostly it serves as a personal motivator for Lucy to begrudge her father. It also serves as an origin story for Maximus. This may sound profound enough. Surely the main character's primary motivation is sufficient narrative payoff, right? Well, the problem is that the show narratively places Shady Sands as a somewhat small detail in the story of Lucy's character. Classic Fallout games didn't tend to put characterization above the world in that way. Not even for the player. They always did a great job of making you feel like you were a small figure in a massive world. Most of the big changes you can impart upon the world involve a lot of small steps and a lot of effort until you reach the payoff. Like going to the Glow just to join the Brotherhood of Steel. You get a sense that this is a logical world that's not simply spun up for player convenience. But because of what the show has done, the culmination of the NCR, after decades of world building, from Shady Sands in Fallout 1 to their empire in New Vegas, it all has very little bearing on the story of the show except to serve as fodder for character development, where Shady Sands' destruction is narratively subject to the drama between Lucy and her father. I like character development, but there's only so much world building you can justify sacrificing to that end, at least if you're coming into a 25-year-old franchise. Now, this story beat is a pivotal detail in the relations of these two important characters. I just don't think it was a good enough exchange. Even the NCR remnants that you see are really just there to give an opportunity for the ghoul to show his conscience after Lucy's influence. I don't necessarily think a character-focused narrative is bad, but it gets to the point that a small number of people completely eclipse the totality of the world behind them. A charitable interpretation is that the show is trying to express tragedy and loss in a language that it understands. Character-focused drama, presented from the perspective of the main characters whom we follow the whole time. There isn't much emphasis on world building at all. I suppose the issue is just that it doesn't seem like Shady Sands was theirs to nuke. I would not care at all if the showrunners invented some new NCR town to blow up and make Lucy sad about. We didn't need to kill all of Aradesh's descendants to reach that level of narrative development. Oh yeah, and Vault-Tec is apparently responsible for nuking Shady Sands, which, in addition to being logistically dubious, it doesn't make a lot of sense. The motive for nuking Shady Sands is kind of complicated. It has to do, seemingly, with both personal motivations from Hank and Vault-Tec's will to get Shady Sands out of their way for their Bud Askin's utopia. It's pretty nonsensical, especially because Shady Sands is a completely inexplicable choice of target. The NCR loves corporations that abuse their power. Imagine that you are the last remaining pre-war corporation and you have access to a brand new industrious civilization. You have things to sell them that they can't get anywhere else. They would want to pay you. That's exactly the kind of power structure that corporations thrive in. Why would you nuke them? So that you can rule a pile of radioactive glass instead of building a corporate enterprise? If you had to nuke somebody in the post-apocalypse to secure your interests from the position of something like Vault-Tec, why would you nuke this burgeoning market of buyers with money and industry? The NCR is a path to power. But let's afford a lot of charity here. People being prone to senseless violence isn't really off base for Fallout. And Vault-Tec doesn't just want money, they want to build a society from scratch in their image for their Budtopia. So let's assume that they just really want to nuke people. You know who it makes a lot more sense to nuke? The Brotherhood of Steel, an organization that's entirely committed to making sure people like Vault-Tec, Bud Askins, and Hank don't do the things that we see them doing in the show. A notoriously heavy-handed and paternalistic organization that wishes to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons and other technology. They would be diametrically opposed to what Vault-Tec is trying to do, but apparently Vault-Tec couldn't spare a nuke for them. The reason this happened is because the Brotherhood of Steel is the face of the franchise. You need a bunch of guys wearing power armor and shooting people. The NCR is just like weird lore nerd stuff. Besides the impact on characterization and plot development, the nuking of Shady Sands has very negative world repercussions, which go beyond the story of the show itself. It served effectively to press the reset button on this universe, because you need to maintain that lawless Mad Max fantasy. Every corner of America must be trapped in perpetual stagnation for centuries, and I just don't think that's a worthy trade. In fact, I'd say it's a loss for both what is lost and what is received. This stagnation is a terrible world-building decision on part of the show, irrespective of how I feel about the old lore being tarnished. Think about it. More time has passed since the Great War than between this video's upload and the death of Thomas Jefferson. Why is the entire planet still a sub-third world society everywhere? Classic Fallout would show people farming or trading to get a sense of how they survive long enough to build anything. And build they would. There's a sense of progress where you can check in on Shady Sands in Fallout 2. They're a budding civilization like I mentioned before, but there's also other places like this. Vault City, San Francisco, New Reno. The world is trending towards development. People bill Fallout New Vegas as a post-apocalyptic game, but Fallout 2 was already heading in that direction. And that's a novel spin on a post-apocalypse. Something you really don't see very much, and something that I don't think was worth blowing up to tell the same old story. Yeah, get rid of all that boring stuff about new civilizations rising from the ashes. We need more apocalypse core corrugated metal shacks. Now, there was, of course, a necessity driving this creative decision. You know, if you want to set a Fallout game on the West Coast again, the NCR presents a serious problem. They are a full-blown civilization. They've annihilated all the raiders. They've kept the peace. They've turned everything post-apocalyptic into a society that mirrors our own. From a certain point of view, this progression means they got rid of all the fun stuff. Indeed, this would probably be a rather mundane world to explore, the world of the NCR, which is why New Vegas takes place on a faraway frontier that the NCR has barely established a foothold in. But if you want to revisit the West Coast, then what? Just nuke it. The NCR was getting a bit too big for its britches. Gotta keep it apocalyptic, and I understand why that is, just know that this was not really the story of Fallout as it had been envisioned before. Shady Sands poses an existential problem to the aesthetic of Fallout that people are actually attracted to. Because people don't want this to be a universe about people who build walls out of clay, like anyone in the world ought to be able to do. They want this universe in the darkness of the post-apocalypse, where not even the Brotherhood of Steel has recovered the lost technological wonder of stacking bricks. The world of Fallout 1 and 2 was often bleak, and it did seem pretty clear that the scars would be everlasting. But people were building fresh new towns, forming companies, developing science, building works, advancing their communities. They weren't just clinging to their corrugated metal shacks, wallowing in the mud like they're content with such destitution. And I think reverting the universe to just that being the end state of humanity made this world way less interesting.
There's nothing here except death and sand.
Yeah, the Road Warrior thing is kind of fun, but I feel like if you've seen it once, you've seen it all. It really does just feel like Shady Sands was made an example of for threatening the status quo, and so it was sacrificed on the altar of leather jackets and pipe guns. Lest it seem like I'm putting a bit too much stock in this one decision, look at New Vegas. They basically unmade that city. It's appeared in Season 2 now, and it's a total wreck. Not quite nuked, but it's overrun with death claws. So now we have a pattern of beacons of civilization being unmade. And I think now it's safe to guess at not the intent here. The issue with Shady Sands, it's not about my beloved factions or settings being beset with any amount of hardship or misfortune. Bulldozing, rather, is about when potential is wasted. If you want an example of this being done right, New Vegas, as usual, provides. In New Vegas, the Brotherhood of Steel, the poster boys of the franchise, and one of the major players all the way back in Fallout 1, are hardly doing any better than the NCR in the show, being reduced to battered remnants. It is sad to see groups like the Brotherhood in such an undignified circumstance, fallen from grace after years of corruption and lack of purpose, with the world advancing beyond the need for the Brotherhood's protection, putting them at odds with everyone around them. But I don't call this bulldozing because the story gains great depth from this, and it's not contrived. It follows as a natural consequence of the story, the setup that we saw in previous games. The Brotherhood was a rigid institution that was a product of the immediate post-apocalypse, where they saw it as their solemn duty to protect the last vestiges of humanity from the horrors of the past, like FEV and atomic weapons. It is a high-minded ideal that would inevitably become outdated, and their pursuit of that ideal leaves them as effectively little more than glorified raiders in the eyes of everyone else. They ended up losing their stature and their honor because of logical consequences of what they are and the direction the world has taken. Such a group is naturally incompatible with a rapidly advancing civilization. Contrast this with the Brotherhood in the show, which is in fact doing quite well for themselves, which I don't consider a victory of storytelling because they've been flanderized as technology hoarders to the point where they would nuke a city for owning a toaster. This society of engineers, technicians, and scientists is shown being amazed at the sight of a refrigerator and unwilling to let a car exist. They never even pay any lip service to their founding principles. The reason I favor New Vegas has little to do with the creative pedigree, the fact that this was made by many of the original game's creators. The difference lies in the execution. The Brotherhood, the Khans, the followers of the Apocalypse, the Masters, super mutants, even a few Enclave remnants are all brought into New Vegas on the brink of extinction, with many of these groups destroyed or broken in most endings, none truly having the potential to fully reclaim their lost glory. And in this post-apocalyptic setting that opens with the line, "War never changes," that seems, like some kind of thematic intention. You might even say it's what Fallout has always been about. Any of these factions' portrayals could have gone as badly as the show's handling of Shady Sands and the NCR. The difference being that in New Vegas, all of these factions are used in service of an interesting story that was a worthy send-off to them, even if they suffer greatly and ultimately end. I'm okay with seeing them make mistakes and being driven to the verge of extinction, when this outcome seems like actual consequences of the world they inhabit and the choices they would actually make. That's just good storytelling, not what I would consider narrative bulldozing. I'm not any more sad about Shady Sands, except that it was a creative idea that was ruined without reason. I wish we had gotten a story of such depth as the NCR Brotherhood wore out of its destruction. Instead, we get a greedy Vault-Tec executive nuking all of his potential customers because of personal issues with his wife. Destruction is not the point of failure itself, but this wasn't worth it. So, to summarize, it's not about what happens to the faction or what kind of light they're portrayed in. Fallout 3, in fact, had the Brotherhood portrayed in a very good light, in a very powerful role. And I didn't really like that either because they took everything interesting out of the equation and made them generic do-gooder Boy Scout types, whose presence in the region to begin with is pretty hard to reconcile, especially if they're sacrificing their lives for the sake of this altruistic mission. It's just a gross misappropriation of their image, and the show does the same thing with the NCR, where they pretty much just show up at the end to be the generic good guy cavalry, and we just take it for granted that they're good, even though the show doesn't really tell us anything about what they were, except that they had a city in the post-apocalypse. Even if you take the history of Fallout completely out of the equation, this total lack of world-building setup just doesn't tell a good story on its face, and it waters down what very good setup it had. The cost of abandoning world building is high. It results in an endless treadmill of things being reduced in depth and meaning. Any intellectual value in the story is degraded and it simply becomes less interesting. The lack of interest in world building has turned super mutants from an interesting point about the human condition to big green guys you shoot at to get ammo. To that end, I commend Bethesda for making a fairly fun Fallout-themed first-person shooter series, but I have to admit the story was not as engrossing as what came before. Meanwhile, Meanwhile, what are some of Bethesda's original inclusions? Talon Company? What's their deal? Can you tell me? This is a really basic question. What is the Talon Company about? And it's one I'd struggle to answer, unlike any such question in classic Fallout, for anything as prominent as Talon Company. Talon Company makes some hits on you at the behest of some mysterious, evil guy, all for you gaining good karma. That's pretty much their entire narrative presence. They're just there to be enemies for good karma characters. However, that's really stupid because the effect is ultimately that some shadowy villain wants you dead for giving teddy bears to orphans or for giving a dying man some water. Now on my part, this would just be nitpicking about a game mechanic if not for the fact that this is genuinely the most interesting point of discussion about Talon Company. The second most interesting thing about Talon Company is that one of their character models has a head and neck which is a different race from the rest of his body. You never find any primary sources like logs or NPCs from the Talon Company that offers you some perspective on why they exist, what manner of people they are. They're just generic thugs who act like jerks to you before attacking, and that's about it. Despite their presence in perhaps the most chaotic region of the Wasteland ever seen, where they are an organized group that has more manpower than seemingly anyone else, there's vanishingly little dialogue about them.
Yeah. Bye.
I can only recall Riley's Rangers even mentioning their existence, and they mostly frame them as an unfriendly business rival. No one else really has opinions on this massive, hostile, heavily armed band of mercenaries, who are presumably for hire, but no one ever hires them to do anything other than kill good people. Why is everyone so worried about the Enclave when the Talon Company is pretty much doing the same thing minus the power armor? A lack of care in world building invites these kinds of questions, taking any astute player out of the experience, which is a big problem in an RPG, a genre of game that's meant to be an exercise in world building to some extent. Raiders are, of course, a staple of most post-apocalyptic fiction and are definitely a major part of the Fallout series from the start. However, of course, the form has been altered from the original games. Now in Fallout 3 and 4, Raiders pretty much act as a faction of enemies that attack you, much like Talon Company. They're not as bad because they're not really meant to be a unified faction. Conceptually, Raiders represent a broad human tendency to prey upon their fellow man. There is no unified Raider faction in the lore, so I understand what they're going for here. The issue is you may start to wonder why disparate Raiders all seem to follow the same exact patterns of behavior and dress. While Raiders are not part of a unified formal group, it does come off that way at face value because of how uniform they actually are. In Bethesda Fallout, Raiders, rather than feeling like a broad occupation of sorts, feel more like a species of person, as hard-coded as the Master's super mutants. They all wear these spiky, crazy leather armor outfits. They're all drugged up sadistic psychos who revel in extreme violence. You know what a Raider is. Ultimately, the reason they're like this in Bethesda games is because they're just trash mobs. They don't really have any narrative presence either. Raiders are pretty much a force of nature. Less of a world-building asset and more of a gameplay one. In classic Fallout, however, Raider wasn't something so uniform. The term Raider was applied to a pretty varied type of person. Some of them could be wearing your classic Raider leather armor, but others might be wearing a normal leather jacket with blue jeans. They looked like normal people, because what is a Raider? Is it a type of individual? No, it's somebody who's raiding, attacking other people. That doesn't require you to look any specific way or have any certain requisite level of sadism, which is why it helps when the original games did have them vary in appearance somewhat, and in behavioral tendencies instead of them all being the same class of person. New Vegas picked up where Fallout 1 and 2 left off. Raiders, instead of just being a generic class of human, were comprised of specific groups like the Jackal gangs and Vipers and the Khans. All of which are just different groups of people whom you might call Raiders. Not because they are some kind of class, but because that's what they happen to be doing. It's not the totality of their identity. There's some different history between the different Raider groups. It's not really dwelt upon much. The Vipers and Jackals really aren't important at all. But the fact that they are named groups alone makes them feel less video gamey. The name carries with it the implication confirmation that these are distinct groups with histories and not just cardboard cutouts of targets that you're supposed to shoot. The raiders harassing Shady Sands are in fact the Great Khans from Fallout New Vegas, and you can see the Great Khan imagery in both games, and that's a very small thing, but it's still more than the Talon Company ever displayed. It's more than you could ever draw out of the Fallout 3 raiders. It's such a minor consideration, but it's enough to signify that this is a group with a culture and history, some unique characteristics that tie the individuals in the group together to maintain their cohesion. And you can talk to them, of course, which further shows what manner of people they are. They are involved in quests that you can resolve through dialogue, which isn't the case for really any raiders from Bethesda games aside from Nuka World and Lugnut.
Give me the naughty nightwear.
My favorite detail is where if you have a high enough luck stat in Fallout 1, there's a good chance that when you walk into the raider camp, they'll think you're the reincarnation of their previous chief risen from the dead due to a coincidental resemblance. A chief which the current chief killed to assume his position. And that's a fun little detail that characterizes these people, more than the game necessarily needed to. It's not much, but the thing about world building is that much of it can be subtextual or implicit as long as you signal to the audience that there was some thought put into it. That's enough to produce a small bud from which a great story can later blossom from. The audience can be trusted to presume more about it, and later on it can be developed to expand from that past work. What little we learned of the Khans from classic Fallout was enough for them to be an identifiable group that could later be expanded upon in New Vegas. The added context from New Vegas retroactively enriches the story of Fallout 1 and 2, whereupon in New Vegas you see the payoff of decades of this blood feud between the NCR and the Great Khans, with the Great Khans eventually sort of playing the innocent victim in the conflict with the NCR. But if you go back far enough, you'll see that it was the Great Khans who brutalized the NCR at their most vulnerable moments, before they even were a functioning country. And that's just one benefit of the narrative continuity between classic Fallout and New Vegas. Here you have an actual instance of war never changes, a theme that's hard to convey within a single game. But now, well, there doesn't really seem to be any more Khans or Shady Sands because, well, you know, Shady Sands was nuked. The Khans are just generic enemies for Lucy to shoot, so I suppose it is a good adaptation of Fallout 4 at least. And Fiend has apparently become a generic term for cannibals according to the show. Even these fairly minor components of the story have been bulldozed. It might seem harmless to have generic raiders, but doing the bare minimum to establish them as an actual group of people can lend itself to huge payoffs down the line, as we saw in New Vegas. And even when I played New Vegas without knowing anything about the previous game, the fact that these were distinct groups made me a lot more interested in resolving quests that had anything to do with them. The choice to forfeit all of this was a mistake. Plenty of other things in Bethesda Fallout are at least fun on their own. Like Arafu, the bridge town that's besieged by vampires. Oasis, the one place that's rejuvenated with life. Rivet City, a town that's in an aircraft carrier. Megaton, which, well, Megaton's just inexcusably ridiculous. But the point is, a lot of these things are fun or interesting in vacuum, but none of them actually fit into any kind of bigger puzzle. They're just a bunch of disparate elements that don't cohere. And that's exactly the type of thing that much of Bethesda Fallout is comprised of. Things that don't build into any kind of world-building structure. It's not like the original game, especially, where most things actually did have a bigger place in the story. A story about humanity as a whole in this post-apocalyptic world. Whereas Fallout 3 is a game where you can easily forget that Megaton and Rivet City are in the same game because they're completely separate ideas that never intersect in any meaningful way. What do Megaton residents think of the Brotherhood of Steel? How does the Enclave affect Rivet City? What do these cities think of each other? You will not find any answers. In a way, Bethesda Fallout games often end up feeling like a bunch of mini-worlds stuck together, almost like you're in an amusement park. And amusement parks can sure be fun and memorable, but they do not make robust stories. They sequester any kind of narrative into disparate chunks. Now, I don't ask that all of these mini-worlds have direct ties to each other. You're allowed to have isolated locations in your story, but they could at least demonstrate some truth about the world or exhibit a theme, offer some characterization. None do. You could take Megaton out of Fallout 3 and put it in Fallout 4, and neither game would be meaningfully different from a narrative perspective. The towns in Bethesda Fallout are the RPG equivalent of an anthology show, where every episode is its own universe. But taken as part of a continuous, decades-long story, this isn't a good thing at all. It's the mark of not incompetence per se, but the lack of a singular guiding vision. Too many things get past the boardroom without anybody canceling them. There's no unified purpose in the incoherent story elements of Bethesda Fallout, because Fallout 3 and 4 in particular are just anything goes with an apocalypse coat of paint. There's a lot of fun, creative energy in Bethesda games, and I think people who are rightly disappointed for a lot of understandable reasons don't see what's so good about these games at all. The positive attributes of Bethesda Fallout are things that make for decidedly bad stories by the standards of classic Fallout. And as much as I may be excusing Fallout 3 in a lot of what I say, I have to admit, these mini-worlds don't really get a free pass, because they do bring thematic harm to the story as well. Fallout 3's often whimsical characters and settings lend themselves to problems if you think about it. There is a lady in Arafu who seems to believe that she lives in the pre-war world, talking about kids playing in the yards and such. And this is the annoying side of Bethesda's tendency to dwell on the past, where it has logical implications that don't make any sense. How would she have any concept of the pre-war world at all? You can't really hallucinate about something that you couldn't even imagine. On a societal level, look at Tenpenny Tower, land of the posh rich folks who, what do they do exactly? How does one get to be a snooty rich jerk in a post-apocalyptic wasteland? What do they have to offer the security guards that protect them? Where does their money come from? What are your lore theories on what on earth these Tenpenny Tower rich people are supposed to be doing? Are they secretaries? Maybe they invest in the stock market? There's no answer to these questions, because an answer isn't the point. This is just the rich jerks exhibit at the amusement park. Pretty much the entirety of the Bethesda games are like this, which is frustrating when they have made games that are more grounded and serious and sensible despite taking place in magical fantasy settings. You know, Fallout 1 actually had a Tenpenny-esque figure whose name was somewhat similarly Mr. Hightower. The difference here is that you could actually tell why Hightower was rich, because instead of being in a random building in the middle of the wasteland, the place he runs is in a city that already has a fully fledged economy, and there's not an entire community of snooty rich jerks. It's just him and the people whom he pays and runs the operation of. This really isn't a lot that I'm asking for here. I remember when I was a kid, I thought Fallout 3 was more interesting than New Vegas, because the towns and NPCs were more imaginative. Arafu, the bridge town besieged by vampires, versus Prim. A real place? I mean, how boring is that? It all seemed so mundane in comparison. At the time, I just didn't appreciate that you can look at a place like Helios 1 and see such great history has taken place there. With thematic relation to the overall story, defining the broader world, it even characterizes the pre-war reality where this solar plant is some horrifying weapon of mass destruction. Ultimately, this approach from New Vegas was more worthwhile than mindless fun and wonder. Part of growing up is realizing that Fallout 3 has problems. There's a big town that awaits all Fallout fans, and it's called New Vegas. When I said Shady Sands wasn't theirs to nuke, I didn't mean this as a point of possessiveness. My issue is that they got rid of everything interesting and replaced it with random senseless junk like Talon Company or the Gunners in Fallout 4, which are pretty much the direct successor of the Talon Company in terms of narrative presence, which is to say, they're completely uninteresting. The real harm in not leaving Shady Sands alone isn't how sad I feel about it. It's that it's left this narrative bereft of anything interesting. The Fallout universe had nothing else to offer but the association with more interesting concepts that they've now wrung dry. I'm not such a stickler for world building that I demand the robustness of Tolkien from an action RPG, but the abandonment of lore is a steep decline that never levels out. You virtually never see efforts to dial things back when they go out of control, cases like New Vegas being some kind of miracle. When you start destroying things and replacing them with less interesting alternatives that don't make any sense and have no narrative context, what are you left with? What's the point of this series? If the story is nothing but a bunch of pathetic wastelanders who never outgrow their corrugated metal shacks, why should I care about helping them next time? Why is there even a pretense of continuity if the circumstances are always exactly the same, no matter where you go in the country? And you never go outside the country, of course. Things never get better or worse. Every single region is going to feature Deathclaws, Brotherhoods of Steel, super mutants, and of course, corrugated metal shacks being the apex of human architectural achievement. And none of these things ever change no matter how much time and distance is added. So why should I be interested in exploring a new region or keeping track of any continuity when it's always the same? It's like Ron Perlman said, lore. Lore never changes. There's no underlying story to dig into, just an aesthetic with some fun stuff along the way. There's no point in trying to understand any of it. The only greater meaning beneath it all is to have recognizable cutouts for the shooting gallery. One of the biggest points of discourse about classic Fallout lately is this idea that the games have a deep-seated anti-capitalist message. I've gotten in discussions about this over the past couple years where people often balk at the very notion that Fallout wasn't all about capitalism from the very start. However, it's very hard to look at these games and judge them on their own merits and come away with such a conclusion as that. The most frustrating thing is that those arguments are used to validate the Fallout TV show going in a really outrageous direction where they blame corporate greed for engineering the circumstances that led to nuclear war. I believe this to be the most significant betrayal out of every creative decision to have been made in new Fallout. It's frankly a dumb plot point. And it also belies the stated beliefs of the original games, and people have the nerve to invoke the original games in defending this plot point by claiming Fallout has always been about capitalism. So let's analyze the political substance of classic Fallout to see what these games actually demonstrated about capitalism. Now, Fallout 1 was a game that I would say is almost completely devoid of any overt political messaging. The ideals of the pre-war world especially are far outside of people's concerns. No more than fixing potholes is politics a salient point of focus to the average wastelander. That's not all there is to the game, of course, but I need to emphasize that the experience is generally rooted in this world where the past is dead and buried. Story points that could be considered to have an anti-capitalist undercurrents are the bits about West Tech from Fallout 1 and Vault Tech in Fallout 2. West Tech is really the only evidence of evil corporate shenanigans you see at all in the first game. West Tech, to summarize, developed the Forced Evolutionary Virus, FEV, through human experimentation. As you read the terminals, however, it becomes clear that the company only started to do villainous stuff after the government took over the entire project. In the sum total of the game, this is pretty much the only sign of any atrocity by any corporation that you actually see. This is the closest Fallout 1 gets to any hard-hitting message about capitalism, and the government is the real bad guy. There is nothing else to go on in the first game. But what about the classic evil villain corporation Vault Tech? Vault Tech is a corporation we all remember for its truly driven commitment to experiments that seem to have very little purpose to their design other than achieving new heights in human suffering. There's some really zany off-the-wall stuff in how these experiments play out, and the exploration of vaults in newer Fallout games is usually going to involve unraveling the mystery of how Vault Tech's experiment drove a community of people who survived the apocalypse to extinction. But the funny thing about Vault Tech is that the company doesn't even come off as remotely evil in Fallout 1. There's nothing to imply that the vaults are part of an experiment, and that is an idea some of the creators had in their heads, but it's not really reflected much, if at all, in the game itself. In Fallout 1, Vault Tech looks to be at worst naive, maybe a little cheap, cutting corners, perhaps not buying from the highest bidder. But, aside from that, in Fallout 1, all evidence seems to show that Vault Tech was a fairly honest company whose customers got more than their money's worth out of their purchase. Vault Tech is arguably the savior of mankind. No nefarious intent is attributed to them. This does change well within the classic Fallout era, with, of course, Fallout 2, where Vault Tech is revealed to have been subverted for the Enclave experiment. But it's the same sort of deal as West Tech. Vault Tech, along with another company, Poseidon Energy, has gone through such a transformation where these evil corporations are fronts for the Enclave. They've been hollowed out and are used to further the Enclave's evil plans. I do think it would be wrong to say that these games aren't political in any sense. However, none of this really maps to a straightforwardly anti-capitalist reading. Fallout 2 especially is highly skeptical of centralized power. There's a distrust of anything getting too big or declaring itself too legitimate to be questioned. But there's nothing in there about seizing the means of production, equitable distribution, free markets, or regulation. Nothing like that at all. I'll also emphasize that all of this stuff I've talked about is a pretty small part of the game, except for the Enclave. It's mostly in the background. And even though Fallout 2 confirmed that the vaults were designed for experiments, the nature of those experiments isn't really expounded upon beyond the fact that they house people that have data collected about them as part of the Enclave's agenda. The president of the Enclave does offhandedly mention a few of these experiments, but you never really see any horror show vaults in Fallout 2. The only bearing this has on the story at all is that Vault-Tech's experiments inadvertently generated two populations, Arroyo and the still extant Vault 13 residents, which are beneficial to the Enclave's agenda, the Enclave being the real beneficiaries of Vault-Tech's experiments. The presence of healthy survivors appears to be a successful mark of the experiment as far as Fallout 2 is concerned. Once Fallout entered 3D, there was a dramatic escalation in the absurdity of these experiments, often verging on otherworldly. Vault-Tech went on to become the familiar Aperture Science-esque company that is somewhat outlandishly obsessed with bizarre and torturous human experimentation. Notably, this is one of the few departures by Bethesda that found its way into New Vegas, a point which should hopefully disarm any allegations that I'm just anti-Bethesda. Yes, the original creators who worked on New Vegas apparently liked this idea. It's not all bad, but my take on it is that many of the Vault experiments feel like setups for Twilight Zone episodes more than anything that coheres to the Fallout storyline. And I'll say, this isn't unwelcome to the story. These Vault experiments are fun to unravel, and they make for pretty good Twilight Zone episodes, but that does not make for a very robust pillar of world building. And this is something that comes off as a retcon. Some of the creators of the original games did indeed have ideas for vaults as experiments. As early as Fallout 1, Tim Kaine, for instance, imagined it as an effort to test the human ability to survive on a multi-generational colony ship. You'll find references that cite his perspective on the matter on the wiki, but the actual end of the Vault's experiments is shrouded in mystery in Bethesda games, which is to say, the answer is probably deliberately obscure, and there's not any evidence that ties the experiments we see to space travel, even if you stretch the logic to cover any angle of pertinent human social factors. Whatever there may be to take away from these experiments, given who the obvious beneficiary is, it's a bit of a stretch to just assume that they're a critique on capitalism. Fallout 2 does have a stronger political layer to it, with the government and corporations conspiring against the interests of the American wasteland. However, to summarize this as if the game is a grandstanding narrative against capitalism in particular is a gross mischaracterization of what the Enclave represents. The Enclave is an echo of the past that has clung to the history that I've talked about, how dead and buried it is, and they've held it so successfully that they've made themselves incompatible with the rest of the world. They are an old order that refused to die with everyone else, and so preserved their power and their image. They consider themselves the legitimate government of the United States, the rightful inheritors of the world. They have a president and an army. Their efforts at self-preservation, however, have led them in conflict with the very existence of life in the wasteland. Their claims mean nothing to the outside world. The government they embody does not effectively exist outside of their isolated territory. Meanwhile, they see wastelanders as a threat to their very existence. The Enclave's genetic purity, technology, ethos, all of it is rooted in a world that no longer exists, but it's a world they wish to cling to and revive, and the only way they see fit to do so is to wipe the slate clean. Rather than assimilating into the wasteland, they choose to rid the world of all conflicting elements. Their obsession with purity has bred a fixation on the past, which has made them diametrically opposed with the world that we know in Fallout. What I'm saying is that the Enclave is a metaphor for Bethesda Fallout. but also contrast them to the NCR, another group that seeks to revive the American ethos and technology and civilization, but they do so by building upon the ashes, taking from what the world has become, rather than placing themselves at odds with the nature of the world. The NCR is, if anything, more capitalist than the Enclave, and while they're not framed as unambiguously good, they're not generally your enemy. I've discussed in detail the pre-war elements of classic Fallout's political commentary, but just because the actual political machine is destroyed doesn't mean the post-war reality can't have a political valence of its own. It can easily be an expression of some form of politics. So what, in this regard, do we see in the post-war societies of classic Fallout? Well, not really a scathing indictment of capitalism. Societies, while primitive, seem to be trending towards capitalism by default. This is certainly not how most committed anti-capitalists believe human nature to be. Most would argue that, absolved of the former power structures that perpetuated systemic injustice, the framework of capitalism would collapse. People would start over from a more natural state where everyone is roughly equal as individuals, without any artificial class-based stratification. The yoke of the upper class would be thrown off once and for all. According to the general anti-capitalist framework, capitalism is absolutely not a natural state of being that humans trend towards absent outside influence. Rather, capitalism is an aberration that came about as a product of centuries of manipulation by the upper classes who jealously guard their heritable power. Yet what we see in Fallout is humanity starting from a mostly clean slate, with no long-held predispositions that corrupt the masses into accepting a structure of oppression. And they trend towards capitalism, unrestricted markets, dog eats dog, rich and poor. The idea of capitalism doesn't just endure, it's apparently the default path of disparate communities, and I think that notion would terrify Marx more than the prospect of a nuclear apocalypse. Junktown, the Brotherhood of Steel, the Hub, they all engage in capitalistic practices regardless of their general principles. The Brotherhood sustains itself by being an arms dealer. The Hub is thriving because it's a trading hub, full of capital, with barons running the show, which, isn't nice, but it's one of the better places in the wasteland. And even the good people of Junktown won't offer you much without a price. The games present no radical argument that this is all a terrible thing. And there's no collectivist communities that reject capitalism. The closest would be Shady Sands, but they become the NCR in what is largely framed as a good thing, and they're the most capitalist group in Fallout. The natural progression of society that the developers assumed looked a lot like capitalism. Now there's a lot in Fallout 2. It's an expansive game that might mention a lot of things in passing. If you wanted to cherry pick, you could probably find a couple things to suggest an anti-capitalist framework. Well, let me do the opposite. There's a character who says greed is good, that it's a misunderstood force which, when utilized correctly, is the greatest of virtues that can bring about more good than any other human motivation. That's basically the human nature argument used to justify capitalistic pro-market economy beliefs. This isn't a quote from a villain that you're supposed to think is wrong. This is the belief of a fairly helpful, good-natured character, and paying into his greed-positive beliefs is the best way to broker a peace between Gecko and Vault City, achieving the best possible outcome for both of those places and making the world a happier place. Do I actually think this means Fallout 2 has a major pro-capitalist agenda? No, not really. But it does not really help the assertion that the game is set on a foundation of anti-capitalism, does it? From the first game, you can cite Junktown. You have this conflict between Killian Darkwater, the honest, community-oriented frontier justice mayor, versus Gizmo, the greedy, fat, corrupt capitalist pig who runs a gambling enterprise. Gizmo is a bad guy. He is a villain through and through. He wants to murder Killian, just for standing in the way of his greed. But if you decide to murder Killian, as Gizmo requests, and place Gizmo in charge, Junktown will actually thrive. thrive, becoming a prosperous capitalist utopia. So was Fallout 1 anti-capitalist? To be clear, I don't think this is really the mark of any serious conviction by the developers in favor of capitalism, but I also don't think that it's the type of plot outcome that a serious, staunch anti-capitalist would write, even as a joke. This widespread meme that Fallout was always this big anti-capitalist diatribe is nothing more than a collective false memory. However, there certainly has been a shift in that direction, where newer Fallout media does bear a stronger political valence in general, and a lot of that does have a negative read on capitalism. The thing is, people seem to just retroactively impose that upon the original games. Bethesda's Fallout did introduce this prominent Red Scare theming, as well as countless discoverable instances of corporate misconduct from before the Great War, sometimes getting to the point of absurdity where nearly every corporate office seems to have literal skeletons in the closet after some kind of union busting incident, or you'll find incriminating messages where everyone from the receptionist to the CEO is gloating about their evil abuses of consumer trust. All these greed-driven violations of public welfare pop up in every corporate ruin you find. So there is a strong undercurrent of profiteering-driven misconduct in Bethesda Fallout. It only gets more prevalent from Fallout 3 to 4 to 76, but that stuff just wasn't in the first two games. I would not go as far as to say it never would have been there. I don't speak for the developers, but the old games just didn't really touch on pre-war life in such a personal way. The Red Scare is so prominent in post-Bethesda Fallout that it seems to be the defining cultural mindset of pre-war society. It makes sense because they've been in a Cold War for like a century, but that's a story element that just wasn't in the original games. What ideologies had anything to do with the collapse or what people believed in beforehand isn't really a point of discussion, and the war is framed as being downstream of innate human impulsivity just on a grander scale. Latest in a long line of historical trends that define human existence. Fallout 1 and 2 wasted no time in stating, in no uncertain terms, that the actual ideologies of the nations at hand are completely irrelevant.
The details are trivial and pointless. The reasons, as always, purely human ones.
The war is just a bygone accident with irrelevant causes, and it's something we all just have to deal with. Human nature, human impulsivity causes us to inflict tragedies of a higher magnitude than we can ever imagine upon ourselves. When the world was wiped clean, it meant that the political issues that you, yes, you care so dearly about, contributed nothing to the course of humanity, but to act as a bit of pointless trivia before the destruction of everything you hold dear. In classic Fallout, there's not a single thought spent dwelling about the monsters who caused this, because the nukes were launched by you and me. No individuals are particularly blameworthy. There's nothing left to fight over anyway. That's why the games never dwell on who fired first or who's really to blame for the nuclear exchange, because that's not the point. Any elaboration on the cause of the war, any blame setting, it would just detract from the central point. That it doesn't matter, and that's what's so tragic. You cannot avoid this fate simply by pursuing the right economic principles or having the proper stance on recycling. It's more fundamental than that. Now, the Bethesda games never go out and say who did it. They do talk a lot more about the lead up to it, but I wouldn't necessarily go as far as to say what they did was a betrayal or anything like that. The show blew it up, the maniacs.
There's a lot of earning potential with the end of the world. But we're talking about making a significant investment based on a hypothetical. How can you guarantee results?
By dropping the bomb ourselves.
The show presents us with a conference of a secret cabal of billionaires who have completely taken over America. They have assembled to discuss how they'll claim even more. A suggested solution that they all agree is a good idea is to push the world closer to nuclear devastation, perhaps even launching the bombs themselves. It's actually their motivation to bring about an apocalypse. The show never outright confirms that it was actually they who were responsible, but even so, I consider this a tremendous betrayal of the original game's message. The whole narrative premise premise of classic Fallout was that no one wanted such a disastrous outcome, and we did it anyway, because that's what we are. Making this some kind of deliberate conspiracy that everybody wanted to happen flies in the face of how humanity betrays ourselves through our senseless violence. This reframes a statement about human nature as a matter of will, which was never even suggested in the original games. Giving us a face to blame this outcome for, potentially even pinning the event on these guys, is another point of failure in bearing the themes of the original game. And it's stupid on its face, because a cabal of billionaires who control society are perhaps the very last people who would ever want to level the world that they already rule from the shadows. They have quite literally the most investment in the gears of civilization continuing to turn. What sense does it make to destroy the world that their money is good for? Do they really want to get even more control at the cost of all their holdings being a bunch of ashes and skeletons? All that serves to do is level the playing field. Why would they want to do this? Why would they forfeit their life of luxury for this? And before anyone says the Enclave did the same thing, all they did was follow a contingency to survive the war. The Enclave president in Fallout 2 is clearly not thrilled to have inherited a post-apocalypse that he can rule. After all, the Enclave was already running the show from the shadows. But everyone in the show seems to think that the apocalypse is such a wonderful opportunity. What is there to gain? They went from being secretly in control of the world's largest military and government to having in their name an oil rig and an air station. They're cripplingly vulnerable in Fallout 2 to the point of facing an existential crisis due to circumstances that were honestly a best case scenario for a post-apocalypse. The Enclave knew that being top dog in the post-apocalypse was still worse than simply avoiding the war altogether. No one wants to live in a post-apocalypse because that's crazy. Everyone loses. But they didn't have a choice in the matter because it's bigger than the Enclave. It's bigger than billionaires. It was pretty much an inevitability. It's worse than how dumb the idea is on its face because the finger pointing here detracts from the narrative point that it doesn't matter whether it was communists, China, America, nationalists, billionaires, anarchists, race car drivers, or Martha Stewart fans who caused the apocalypse. The point is that that's not the point. But the show laid a significant portion of the blame upon billionaires. And even worse, they made this plot element one of the driving forces of the show's narrative. The blame game absolves humanity of collective guilt, and bringing the cause of the war to the narrative forefront of the post-apocalypse dismantles this idea that the matter was settled and the cause wasn't worth remembering. If there was anything Fallout was always about, it was about the details being trivial and pointless. They sure aren't anymore. One might suppose that all you need to do to avoid such a horrible fate is just not be a billionaire. Well, there you go. The message doesn't apply to me, doesn't apply to you, just them. When the old games talk about the innate failings of man, they just mean a small council of elites, actually. Now I can externalize all of the blame. The other issue I mentioned was all the focus that this pre-apocalyptic thing gets. Relitigating the causative factors of the war betrays the narrative of the old games in a more subtle way. It makes it so that this central question about who was responsible for the big boom, rather than being trivial and meaningless, is actually salient and very important to figure out, actually. Now, to us, the question of who dropped the bombs first is certainly attractive, but that's not how the narrative should be directed, because it's trivia to everyone in the story. Why would they care about it? But it's also the kind of thing that if you center the plot around it, it's going to suck up all narrative focus. It becomes the most important question in the universe, especially if the jerks responsible for it are still causing trouble. Suddenly, things like the Master, the Enclave, the Great Khans, Caesar's Legion, it's all completely dwarfed.
Let's just say that everything about your whole little world was decided over 200 years ago.
If you start to make the story about who's responsible for the nukes, then every bad thing in this universe rests on their shoulders. And all the other conflicts are a minor sideshow at best. And that is a complete inversion of Fallout's central theme of letting go of the past. Instead, the forgotten memory of the past is actually really important to fight over, says the show. There's a turn of phrase that the games have used that you might have heard.
War never changes.
The point is that war is a product of inextricable human nature. The show uses this phrase too, but it is said with the same level of comprehension that a cargo cult has of the principles of aviation.
War never changes. You look out at this wasteland, looks like chaos. But there's always somebody behind the wheel.
There is? What do you mean by that, Cooper? Cooper utters a line that describes the universal failings of man, and he immediately follows it up by saying that what looks like chaos is always the careful plan of some individual. But chaos did define the wasteland in the original games. That was part of the point. That there was a great reset, with all parties starting more or less from scratch in a world that no one was ready for. This billionaire deterministic framing of the wasteland flies in the face of that. The end of the world occurred only due to a multitude of highly specific avoidable factors involving billionaire conspiracy, imperialism, colonialism, conquest, and war, are results of humanity being manipulated by the upper class into serving as pawns. That's not what Ron Perlman said. The original intro stated that the world is gone, not because of the exploitation of labor or imperialist dogma or a billionaire conspiracy. And it certainly wasn't due to any particular individual being behind the wheel. It's because at our core, we're the kind of species where one kills his own brother. Humans with nuclear weapons was as stable of an arrangement as monkeys with hand grenades. The only other factor besides human nature that gets accredited for the apocalypse is a lack of resources, which is a cold, hard fact of reality and not really a product of one economic model. Especially given that it was a multipolar world with communist China being just as responsible for its end, presumably. Beyond that, no one cares about the abstract philosophical disagreements between some old empires that blew each other up in a forgotten era. What you think of capitalism is your business, but any objective analysis of classic Fallout simply does not read as an indictment against capitalism. It's not some failing of media literacy to note something like that. Tim Kaine talked about this, refuting the notion that capitalism was a major theme in classic Fallout, pointing out that the games were more focused on a general statement about human nature. And his statements provoked a ton of discourse on Reddit, YouTube, and Twitter, some people championing him and others disputing his words. It seemed like everybody had a stake in Tim Kaine's opinion on classic Fallout and capitalism, and Tim Kaine has said a lot of fascinating things about the development of Fallout 1 and 2, but this was basically just him quoting the intro. It was a very straightforward interpretation of the games, yet it became this massively controversial flashpoint that sent shockwaves through the discourse. When the old games said war never changes, they argue that humanity is doomed to repeat its cycle of self-destruction as long as it exists. Humanity's violent impulse is constant regardless of historical context. The games resoundingly attribute the nuclear devastation to this baseline human tendency. And the people who misunderstand this point the most are those who try to twist this message into something specifically about their own pet issue. There is so little room for any misconception here, which is why I tend to assume that these people just aren't that familiar with the old games. Anyway, you know what Fallout has really always been about? Psychic powers. The truth is, the Master's plan to turn everyone into super mutants was actually being done to absorb humanity into a unified collective, all bound by the Master's psychically imposed will. You actually meet several human psychers under the Master's study, and he can cause your head to explode with his own psychic attacks. The Master's will over the super mutants is enforced through psychic means. Humanity is endowed with psychic powers as the next step in human evolution. The Master sees this as the answer to humanity's folly that Ron Perlman talks about in the intros. Unified psychic control is the only viable means that the Master sees to make humanity cease its destruction. But psychic powers are not something that has seen strong recurrence in the series. There's Mama Murphy and that kid in New Vegas with the nullifier on his head. It's a theme that has been forgotten about or relegated to trivia. but it was actually a big component in the story of the first game, being a metaphor for the disunity of man. Is this actually what the series was about? No, but I'm not joking one bit when I say psychic powers are more thematically pertinent in classic Fallout than criticism of capitalism. And there's a lot more to the political discourse about Fallout than just capitalism. And I don't want to go too far in the opposite direction and say there's absolutely no political valence to Fallout 1 or 2 whatsoever. That's not what I believe. The thing is, what presence there is gets exaggerated and also doesn't really build into this overt message that everybody attributes to these games.
So much has changed, but it's what stayed the same that concerns me.
What I think is the root cause of many of these misconceptions about the old Fallout games is not that people collectively hallucinated this wholesale misconstruction of the old games, but rather it's because elements from the old games have been taken and twisted into something else. The fact that many of these things were in fact in the original games misleads people into assuming a strong degree of continuity. Thus, Fallout has always been that way, Fallout's always had that. These are easy assumptions for reasonable people to make. It's not newly invented concepts that bring about the most misconception, but concepts which existed in the originals only to undergo a process of exaggeration. Perhaps the most widespread misconception along these lines is that the famous retro-futuristic aesthetic of Fallout has always been a core conceit of the series. In classic Fallout, you really get the sense of a culture that's just different, rather than being stuck in a specific decade, technologically or socially. The games didn't really talk much about the social norms of the past, but the architecture we see especially is more evocative of 1930s Art Deco than the unrelenting commitment to the 1950s retrofuturism seen afterwards, Terry linking the 1950s to a state of cultural stagnation. Not much about this is overtly said, but there does seem to be a prevailing undercurrent that society was stuck in the past for over 100 years, and that this caused all sorts of problems. I think that's an interesting idea, a really interesting one actually. It's cool, I see why people like this, and I don't hate it or anything, but that's just not what the world building of the original games concerned themselves with. It was mostly fine until Fallout 4 where things started to get out of control. They started to go full Jetsons with everything. A society that was meant to be sort of recognizable except for things related to computers and certain architectural preferences went on to become this Jetson metropolis crazy sci-fi utopian aesthetic where people are all using these water-cooled World War I looking Lewis gun things that we're led to believe were premier 21st century assault rifles. It's not even retrofuturism, it's just totally archaic because there isn't a futuristic element to it. The guns have been oft discussed, but one point I've never seen anyone raise: let's see what the combat armor looked like in the original games. It's more like something you'd see in Aliens or Halo. It has a lot more futurism than retro to it. It's got a visored helmet with some optical gizmo on it. New Vegas would reintroduce this original combat armor, referring to it as the reinforced variant. And that armor in a way looks out of place next to Bethesda's assets being uncharacteristically non-retro in its appearance. Let it simmer that elements from the original games seem unfitting in Bethesda Fallout. Proof enough of the drift. It's crazy to imagine that the original vision of the game had the average soldier looking like RoboCop. And that's if they weren't in power armor. That's such a drastically unrecognizable vision from what 3 and onward present. When it comes to weapon design, Fallout 1 and 2 were a bit of a hodgepodge at times, but it certainly didn't feel like they had this unspoken rule in Fallout weapon design that weapons have to look horribly outdated by modern standards, despite the Great War taking place 130 years after the Second World War. But in classic Fallout, there are guns that are clearly intended to simply look futuristic or modern by 90s standards. like the P90, the Bozar, the Jackhammer, the Blade Runner pistol. Some of these are just real guns. There's no retro angle to a lot of this stuff, it's just plain futuristic. The energy weapons are worth mentioning too. In Bethesda games, they tend to look like something out of Lost in Space. You know, like the stereotypical ray gun from the 50s. In classic Fallout, energy weapons looked a bit more utilitarian, often being like ordinary guns with some science gizmos. The only one that looked so outlandish as the Bethesda spin on plasma weapons was the Alien Blaster, which was pretty much an Easter egg. So all this doesn't concern me just because of aesthetic drift, but because I do believe Bethesda had intended there to be a narrative purpose behind the implicit technological stagnation here. That there was some commentary on 50s culture, the state of America, commentary which was either totally absent or at least far less present in the classic era. The purposeful, focused direction that modern Fallout has with retrofuturism sacrifices the original vision, doing away with what the world of the past had represented. The world of the past in classic Fallout, while familiar in many ways, is beyond understanding in others. The player is beset with many unknowable mysteries, certainly with no answers so bluntly obvious as it was a case of 1950s cultural paralysis. No, there was something else going on with why the pre-war world was the way it was. Something far less self-explanatory. Those huge Art Deco faces carved into the buildings, vacuum tube-based technology, nuclear-powered cars, yet guns that would have been fairly modern to the 90s audience. What exactly was this world? It was a world as foreign to us as it would be to a clueless vault dweller, and because of this, we were able to step outside of our preconceptions and identify more readily with characters like vault dwellers and wastelanders and share their ignorance of the past. Even if we, the audience, are in a better position to recognize what was lost, we still don't know the full picture of the pre-war world, and that's why one of my biggest complaints is how obsessed the new media is with elucidating on the past, and building up this retro-futurist aesthetic is just one part of that. Fallout 4 has a pre-war intro. The Fallout show has a lengthy arc about the pre-war world that is interspersed with the present narrative. Even Fallout 3 goes as far as to make suggestions as to exactly when the point of divergence between the real world and the Fallout timeline was, hinting that something happened at the end of World War II. The more knowledge we gain of the old world of Fallout, the more it is reframed to be an exact replica of 1950s culture that lasted a century, the less alien Fallout's pre-war society is, and thereby the more it becomes a story about the people who got nuked, rather than us wading into a world that we don't know much about. The story becomes about the pre-war living room that we saw in the Fallout 1 intro. Every effort to expound upon the past not only drains narrative focus from the post-apocalyptic world where the games are set, it does so in defiance of the entire narrative premise of Fallout 1 and 2. I much preferred how Fallout 1 immediately throws you into the deep end. You can identify with the protagonist because he doesn't know anything about the pre-war world either. There was no need for any pre-war perspective beyond what we saw in the intro. The audience's own obliviousness to the past was a deliberate creative choice, and it emphasizes the universality of Fallout's core message. Newer Fallout media emphasizes the specifics of what led to the apocalypse, the specifics of the culture of the nations at play, and makes this all look a bit too specific for what was meant to be commentary on inherent human nature. People might even interpret the cultural paralysis of the 50s as being a cause of the Great War. After all, they were so scared of the rising Soviet Union, communist ideology, nuclear war. You might even think that all we have to do to avoid such a fate as the Fallout world is just not act like it's the 50s. I don't think Bethesda really designed their cultural paralysis angle to give that impression, but it does lend itself to that misinterpretation. Classic Fallout deliberately shunned that kind of elaboration, with the few windows to the past showing an indistinct picture, some evidence of nationalistic hysteria, but bound to a flag that isn't even recognizable as 1950s America's. It's not much to go on but a few fleeting glimpses of a world gone mad. mad. Because you're not supposed to get caught up in what system of government brought this hell into being, what economic principles caused the war, what enduring cultural aesthetic brewed a sense of hysteria. The details are trivial and pointless. The retro-futuristic aesthetic in the original games was exaggerated and inflated in importance in the Bethesda era. This may all sound like I have some particular aesthetic grievance, but there's an implicit message that's carried with the aesthetics when they get so much focus, and it's built into widespread misconstructions as to the fundamental premise of this universe, with people retroactively attributing Bethesda's design choices and the reasoning behind them onto games that did not have either. As strange as it may sound, radiation was a trivial detail in classic Fallout, one whose role in the story was minimal until it was inflated tremendously, to the point that it's basically the main point of conflict in Fallout 3. Radiation did not produce scary mutants to scour the wasteland so much as it made the world into an empty, desolate place, bringing the Earth to a state of near oblivion, something Bethesda evidently misinterpreted as they made the game like Oblivion. The story is called Fallout because it takes place in a radioactive wonderland that can be purposed into a TV show, a mobile game enterprise, a card game set, a cheap aesthetic fit for any situation. That's what Fallout is really about now. As it is for radiation, so it is too for many of the things I've talked about. All those minor elements of classic Fallout that have been contorted and expanded into something totally different. This is the cargo cult at work. And nearly every identifiable fixture of Fallout has undergone this treatment. The new media exaggerates almost every little thing it borrows from the old games, inflating the prevalence and prominence alike to become ubiquitous and plot critical. The Brotherhood of Steel was a regional force isolated in one location. It is unbelievable that they should have any presence in DC across 2,000 miles of who knows what. It's impossible to make sense of how they could be equipped to fight a large-scale war there. Fallout Tactics at least had the decency to explain how this was possible. The rest of the franchise generally takes it for granted. Super mutants were also a regional force, only being a product of a freak accident with the Master, who proceeded to spend years trying to perfect them into their current form. Even with his tremendous intellect and becoming the world's expert of FEV, the dumb super mutants of the West Coast are the best he can manage. Fallout 2 showed us that his army's remnants still terrorized the lands around Mariposa, and New Vegas again showed a few survivors of the Master's army. But Bethesda games just put super mutants absolutely everywhere, spontaneously generating in every possible region. Playing Fallout 1 and 2 would leave you with the impression that the kind of thing to make super mutants was a unique circumstance, a cruel cosmic accident that occurred by sheer bad luck, but apparently it just happens all the time. Another one that comes to mind is energy weapons. Energy weapons are ubiquitous in 3D Fallout games, they just litter the map. But in the old games, they were rare weapons that were experimental developments. They never entered full production before the war. It's actually a plot point in Fallout 2 that one of the new Reno gangs is suspiciously armed with an extraordinarily rare weapon, the laser pistol. And as it turns out, the gang could only acquire such rare and exotic hardware because they're being armed by none other than the Enclave. It definitely seemed to be the implication that the majority of energy weapons in circulation were post-apocalyptic productions. You didn't really see them just lying around. Going forward though, that's exactly the case. You'll find laser pistols sitting in a safe inside an office building. Laser weapons are considered low-tier weapons that are only slightly rarer than a shotgun. Average people before the bombs fell just had these pristine, high-end, exquisitely rare weapons sitting in a safe right at their desk jobs. How about the fact that the world is a desert? Fallout 1 and 2 do indeed take place in a desert. That's because they're in California and Nevada. In fact, there are regions in Fallout 2 that are fairly well forested. There was never at any point a pretense that the entire world underwent a desertification process. There are more living trees in Fallout 2's Californian desert than Fallout 3 and 4's Atlantic coastal wilderness. Lest anyone try to frame this as a result of nuclear devastation, which, to be clear, did cause a lot of environmental environmental damage in the story. Still, you'd think the deserts would be the most desert-like and the least forested places, particularly on the edge of the country closest to China. There really isn't any way to rationalize this that isn't adding more problems. The reason the world is a desert in Fallout 3 is not because the new games had some carefully crafted rationale. It's because they looked at the originals, saw that the world had a desert in it, and said that's what the world is full of, and so they got the last word. This issue extends to every minor little thing, like rad scorpions. Why are there rad scorpions in DC? Because scorpions live in the desert, and the whole world is a desert, except the reason there were scorpions in the original game is because it takes place in California, where there are scorpions.
One of the things we used to talk about was what things would be like away from SoCal. There wouldn't necessarily be all these FEV mutants because that's where FEV was. If you moved to the other side of the country, we kind of expected to see wildly different things caused by the radiation. We had scorpions in the Southwest, so that's why we had giant scorpions. You know, we expected to see different things caused by radiation all over the planet.
So just to contextualize what Tim Kaine said here and not put any words in his mouth, this was from a video where he talked about implicit lore and the mindset behind the production of the first game. He wasn't berating Bethesda or anything like that. And I'm not trying to pit this clip against Bethesda, but to demonstrate that there was a more thoughtful, creative mindset behind the kinds of things they chose to include in those games. New games have rad scorpions because someone saw that the original game had scorpions and said that's what the world is full of. The Brotherhood of Steel, alien spaceships, retrofuturism, politics, raiders, rad scorpions. I mean it when I say all of it. This is a pernicious issue because it's so easy for people who haven't played the original games, or even those who have but did not look at the new stuff critically or haven't gone back to them in a long time, or people who just look at a bunch of lore videos that briefly cover all of this stuff. So many different kinds of people interested in the Fallout series are easily able to put their faith in creative consistency as soon as they realize that the elements they recognize from the newer media are in fact borrowed from the old games. They can easily see the common identifiers from a cursory glance and assume that the mutual presence of such identifiers means that the new stories are honoring the legacy of the originals. This is problematic logic because that's how you get disasters like Mothership Zeta. Fallout has always had aliens, therefore it's okay to have more of them, except there's a massive departure between a brief, self-contained Easter egg that you look at, chuckle, and move on from, and a massive 5-hour-long paid expansion pack that is portrayed in complete earnestness as something that actually happens within the story. Heck, the show had a narrative arc regarding the origins of Vault Boy. I don't think anything else could be so demonstrative of skewed priorities. The history of Vault Boy might be the least interesting thing you could ever reveal in this universe, but he's a recognizable element, so he's a major part of the story. And it's all like this when it makes less sense for these common elements to appear where they do, or when they're portrayed in a nonsensical way. The form that these common elements take in the newer media is retroactively projected upon the originals, overwriting them in the cultural memory, and so the differences are forgotten, because the supposed common element is now recognized by its simulacrum, bereft of its original context. Whatever Fallout always was, it's not anymore. It's undergone a Flanderization, becoming an exaggeration of its own former identity. You cannot easily appreciate these failings just by watching a couple YouTube videos or flipping through a wiki. It doesn't matter if there's things called vaults or rad scorpions or stim packs, or if they play the song about Texas Red, or if they show Shady Sands. That's all utterly insignificant compared to the things that did matter. The themes, the character of the story, these less tangible qualities that you can't see through a brief nod, and that you might not know if all you have is a vague awareness of the originals. It reminds me of Sid Meier's Civilization games. I never played them, but I sure know the funny joke about Gandhi loving nukes. I also know that this is a minor thing in a much bigger game that is beloved for many other reasons. But to attract ignorant outsiders like myself who only know that one funny thing about Civilization, some marketing effort would be expended to invoke that common memory, to draw people like me and make us feel like we're in on the joke. This kind of effort can cascade to the point that that's really what Civilization is all all about. One can imagine a Civ TV series whose plot revolves around stopping Gandhi from nuking the world, and people would refute any questioning of this by saying, Civ has always been about Gandhi nuking people. Just look, it was right there in the old games. Don't you know anything? Yes, that sure is a thing that was in the games, but it has an unduly outsized imprint on cultural memory that belies the bigger picture of the original game. I mean, in Civ's case, that was just an unintended glitch, but the same kind of thing is true of narrative elements bereft of their original place. A small element is overstated, and that becomes a defining element of the entire franchise to the outside observer, where minor aesthetic points are the only connective tissues left in the skeleton of a franchise. People are really into this modern Fallout theme, a story of such fine and nerdy pedigree, so why not call back to the old games? Let me just say, I do not hate things by virtue of their popularity. Quite the contrary, I love having common ground with many people. I love cultural touchstones that give us all something to talk about. I don't resent the Fallout show for being popular. The problem is, most people are to classic Fallout as I am to Civilization, and it often feels like the Fallout show is doing that kind of outside-oriented appeal, aimed at people with little to no prior investment, maybe a vague awareness. That's sort of a perverse incentive that degrades the work, and it's reduced Fallout from being about human nature to being about death claws, bottle caps, power armor, dog meat. Remember dog meat? I remember when he was a random dog you found in the first game that would probably get killed and then be gone forever. He existed mostly for a cute Mel Gibson reference, not to be a central pillar of the franchise. I've talked extensively about how there's a problem when a symbol is misappropriated. The music, the retrofuturism and all of that, but I want to talk about how it can be done right. Fallout New Vegas was such a blessing to classic Fallout. The lore isn't a flaming disaster because the setting is fairly proximal to Fallout 2's in time and distance, and it has a strong connection to it. You can even meet several NPCs like Marcus and Dr. Henry from Fallout 2. Characters reference events that occurred in the first two games. The tone is heavily influenced by Fallout 1. New Vegas even includes most of the soundtrack of Fallout 1 as its ambient music. You know, the songs that actually played during 99.9% of the original game. And I can think of no better way to invoke the tone of those games, because the music is striking and it actually works very well in New Vegas. There's nothing deficient about that music. It carries on quite well. So all of these elements, the music, the setting, the tone, felt like it enriched this universe. Like a proper continuation that actually built upon the originals. Most importantly was the narrative development that New Vegas brought, in all sorts of ways, but let's just look at one example. Take the Nightkin. In New Vegas, they are shown to be much like the Master's remnants in Fallout 2, still an active threat prowling the land. They are dangerous, but they also can be reasoned with, because the context of this new story is different. They no longer serve the Master's effort to exterminate humanity, but they're still Nightkin. They're shown to have mental instability beyond the typical super mutant, with reasons that are explored here. This is all really interesting stuff, but Fallout 1 and 2 did not really have much narrative context for the Nightkin. They were just super mutants, but even worse. New Vegas developed upon their story, adding to the foundation. And I bring this all up to say, my complaint isn't just about things being added, things being changed. The Nightkin had a reason to be in New Vegas. There's a logic to their presence that adheres both to the original story and the story of New Vegas. They enriched the narrative of the old games by adding a new layer to an element that wasn't really explored in them. This is so unbelievably different from Bethesda Fallout having inexplicable super mutant incursions brewing in every corner of the globe with little pretense that they serve anything but a gameplay purpose. Bethesda's super mutants almost never talk or reason and have no narrative context beyond being an obligatory, always chaotic evil RPG faction to make the wasteland more dangerous. There has been a lot from classic Fallout that was lost in translation over the years. And now the series is a patchwork of skin, where the very surface level of the first games does remain, but that's all, without anything from the inside. It's just a cheap aesthetic, but this has become the intended end itself. Fallout today is just a means of attaining a post-apocalyptic vibe. Fallout no longer really bears a specific identity of its own, especially anything inherited from the original games, besides some mischaracterized symbols, which have been passed down with no understanding of their purpose. It's really the literal definition of a meme, isn't it? The cultural memory does survive, and that's why Fallout is still a thing, but it's like it's undergone a mimetic mutation, the underlying meaning being altered by the radiation of misinterpretation. The symbols remain without any regard for their original meaning, ironically enough being a strong parallel to certain storylines in the Fallout series. I can only imagine that Ulysses would have a lot to say about the Fallout aesthetic. Fallout has become very popular. That's not a sin, but it's popular for reasons that have nothing to do with its original form. I'm not that invested in franchise in general. If something is made by completely different people who have different beliefs and priorities from a different generation, I can bet that it will be different. That doesn't necessarily bother me. What does bother me is this prevailing narrative where people so strongly insist that there is no such difference, that Fallout was always like this. It was not. People are outraged over Season 2 of the show because they see it as a disgrace to New Vegas, and while some of that is warranted, New Vegas is a game that deserves to have people bat for it. However, what Season 2 did to New Vegas, the first season of the show had already done to the first two Fallout games, for better or worse. Shady Sands, the Brotherhood of Steel, these had the same kind of portrayal as the Legion, the Kings, the city of New Vegas. What the first two games lacked is the same level of advocacy on their behalf compared to what New Vegas has enjoyed. To any who might claim Fallout has always been exactly as it is now to dissuade any criticism, ask yourself, why aren't psychic powers part of the show? Psychers have more legitimacy in acting as a recurring core component of the franchise than the Brotherhood of Steel. They wouldn't be as regionally constrained, but you almost never see them anymore, certainly not in any prominent role. I don't necessarily think they'd add to the story. They would probably not be a good addition, but they're not excluded because they have no narrative legitimacy. It's because psychers are perceived as being fit for fantasy or funny Easter eggs. They can't take center stage in this road warrior, retro futurist apocalypse. They'd confuse the vibe because psychers don't fit in with the hollow aesthetic that Fallout has become. The show is often heralded as something of a salvatory icon, bringing a light of hope to the long and tragic story of cinematic video game adaptations. And I know I've given many complaints, but most of them are either specific moments or something about how the show relates to the games. There have been far more embarrassing adaptations, no doubt. The show might actually be the best video game cinematic adaptation. For one thing, something I did like about the show is that it's actually fairly faithful to the aesthetic of the games. Some adaptations completely disregard even that much commitment to the source material, and gamers are gonna take what they can get here. However, all the good points of the show only strengthen the show's resolve in supplanting the memory of the original games. The more well-liked the show is, the more cultural memory bandwidth is taken from the original games. The show being as good as it is means it can't be offhandedly dismissed as something to ignore. Being one of the best video game adaptations on the screen in any TV show or even movie, it defines Fallout's identity now. It's more culturally significant than the original games. People will be quick to forgive any of the inconsistencies in the tone or the narrative, and I hope that I've made it clear that my gripes aren't coming from an expectation that all the boring lore minutiae lines up perfectly. Instead, it's about the meaning behind symbols, core themes of the game. Those were not worth giving up. In my book, an adaptation is a subject of the original, and I just feel that the show, and to a lesser extent Bethesda Fallout, has ransacked the stories of the original Fallout games, robbing them of their symbols. How good can an adaptation really be if it can't properly transpose one of the most beloved stories of gaming without losing so much? If it can't surpass the storytelling standards of a 1997 computer game, then what are we doing? That shouldn't be an insurmountable standard. You might also be inclined to say it's a good show, but not a good Fallout show. That's not so easily excused. Then why must it be a Fallout show? It's not fair to tolerate something failing to represent its own brand, its own supposed heritage. You cannot compartmentalize this as an irrelevant factor to say that it doesn't damage the old stuff. Because it does. If 20 years ago you tried to strike up a conversation about Fallout at work, anyone who knew the game, it was not some horribly obscure product, would have probably been able to give you a much more interesting conversation than what you'd be able to get out of all the people talking about the show lately. Oh yeah, I loved when they revealed that the billionaires schemed together to bring the world closer to an apocalypse that would ruin all their stuff. I don't care if it stands on its own. Not to mention, it's impossible to have that conversation about the old games now, regardless of which is more interesting. It's been paved over in the collective memory. I don't actually doubt the showrunners' awareness of the original games. I am certain that they at least saw the Fallout 1 intro, and I think they built the entire show off of it. That full motion video intro is the only piece of the game that completely bridges the cultural gap between modern Hollywood showrunners and 1997 interplay video game geeks. This is a point of cultural convergence between such drastically different groups, where they speak a common language. I'm sure the showrunners knew plenty of details about the original games. I don't necessarily even doubt that they played them, but this is definitely the part of the game that would have caught their eye. So they took a cue from it and went running. Unfortunately, they missed the forest for the burnt out trees. That intro was just a framing device. An important one to be sure, but it amounts to just one tiny piece of the original game. But it's become the sole defining element of those games in our collective memory. So I want to take a moment to jump out of the media themselves and just discuss the meta angle, which I've been invoking throughout this essay, often by reiterating the stock phrase, Fallout has always been blank. And the reason I keep saying that is because that exact canned phrase gets slung about carelessly on the internet quite a lot. And the majority of the time that people are saying it, it's to excuse something by making a false equivalence in order to appeal to precedent. They'll say Fallout has always been silly, and they'll justify it by showing a time that Fallout had a joke. And as I said earlier, this same kind of logic is how you get Mothership Zeta. Don't do it, folks. Because that kind of equation can be used to justify anything, any kind of tonal, thematic degradation that you can imagine. This is how you get Ninja Turtles in Magic the Gathering. You gotta rein it in at some point. And any criticism of tonal or aesthetic drift shouldn't just be met with cherry-picking some obscure and not very defining small element of the original games. Even if there is precedent for something, that doesn't necessarily mean it should define the future. I also want to explain why this essay has been so fixated on the show in particular, rather than talking so much about Fallout 4 or Fallout 76 or something. And the main reason is because those are kind of old news, you know. They came out a long time ago. They're not really representative of what I would call modern Fallout. The Fallout show is really the acting governor of the franchise, and I have no doubt that whatever goes into the show will define the franchise for years to come, because it's one of the most well-rated and successful cinematic video game adaptations of all time. A fact which incidentally attracts a lot of positive bias. Not just from Fallout fans, but also from the vast majority of people who have any interest in games as a medium. We're talking about a huge, varied group of people who've been waiting for some solace to shine through the tragic story of cinematic video game adaptations over the years, which have almost all been deservedly panned as long as they've existed. And I'm not saying that this is the only reason anybody could ever like the show. Just that I have no doubt that many people do extend significant grace to the show on the basis of its status as a likable video game adaptation. My point is to say that much of the discourse about the first games amounts to a strategic invocation of their memory in order to score a point in a much larger argument with stakes that really don't have much to do with the original games themselves. The actual content of the games is somewhat ancillary to the discussion that I think most people are actually having, which is a shame because I think these games are really good, especially Fallout 1. So do I hate what Fallout has become? In itself, I don't think it's all that bad. It's an aesthetic that people like for a reason, it's fun, but I just think it's somewhat shallow compared to what it replaced. The show itself isn't necessarily offensive enough to demand this entire essay. It's when, upon donning the title and assets of the older games, everybody just defends it on that basis and denies that there's any standard that it doesn't meet. That's what compels me to note the many, many ways in which it could be said to fall short. The vast majority of people enjoying newer Fallout media have no idea what the originals were like. Newer Fallout media does not uphold the legacy of the originals. Not beyond skin deep anyway. Anyone who's never experienced the old games, be it someone who's barely aware that Fallout exists, or an obsessive who's read every wiki page they can and watched countless deep lore videos on YouTube, neither of these people would know what these games were really like. That they were full of emptiness, silence, and they can easily be led to believe that the first step out of the vault was always something other than dreadful.